Hey guys, and welcome back to Archetype Builds. This is our review of the Wizard in Playtest 7. Now, largely the story of the Wizard in Playtest 7 is the story of reverted changes. So, one thing that has been making the headlines is class spell lists are back because of the Wizard, because the Wizard wanted to go back to class spell lists. Now everyone is back to class spell lists, so that is true. We're also getting Arcane Recovery returning to level 1. The spellbook stuff that was a little bit more complicated last time is not complicated anymore. They've kind of gone back on what that's going to be. Most of the custom spells that they released in the last playtest have been removed. So your modify spell, your memorize spell, or whatever else, those are all gone. And so largely what the changes they proposed are no longer there. Now, I said on my Playtest 5 reviews that I really appreciated the attempt at big changes, big swings, making things more exciting. So it won't surprise you to learn I am disappointed by the decision to undo all those big swings, to take away all of the fun new toys that we were going to get to have, and go for very mild changes instead. One of the changes that they are keeping is this concept of memorize spell. They've now made it a feature rather than a spell, and essentially what this is going to allow you to do to take a minute and pull a spell from your spell book that you hadn't prepared, make it prepared for you. The limitation being only one spell at a time can be moved to prepared in this process. You have this rotating slot where you can pull a spell into your spell prepared very quickly. This means you will oftentimes have access to your entire spellbook for utility purposes. So, in a dungeon crawl for handling traps, for handling, obstacles, you will have all of your spells available more or less because you can cycle through with Memorize Spell, and that comes online at 5th level. We do have a new feature, Scholar, that is similar to Academic that they introduced in the last one. Academic had worked with the study action. This no longer does that. Scholar instead is going to give you expertise with either Arcana, Nature, History, or Religion. You have to have proficiency in one of them, but I believe you do from the Wizard class anyway. I happen to think that these are some very poor skills to get expertise in. Frequently when a DM is asking for one of these checks, it is in order to deliver either lore or critical knowledge or other information that is story dependent, and so I know I as a DM, and I suspect many other DMs, sort of lowball the DC on that so that we can get that information over to the players. But situationally, I guess you might need a higher roll, in which case this is decent. The other big change is a restriction added to Spell Mastery. Now, the spell that you choose for Spell Mastery must have a casting time of an action, which excludes many of the most popular choices for that feature. Now, it's a very high level feature, so I won't spend too much time crying over its nerf. I think Wizards were a very, very, very powerful class. I don't know if you've seen my how many D&D characters are there, but Wizards, because of their huge spell list and the huge number of spells that they get to learn, just combinatorically, exponentially more versions of Wizards than there are of any other class, which means most D&D characters that you can possibly create, like characters that have variations between them, are Wizards. Most D&D characters are Wizards. So the fact that they are nerfed a little bit is not too big of a bummer in my book. They already had a vast array of tools available to them, and they still do. So these nerfs are coming towards the high end of the class, whereas the buffs, things like Memorize Spell and the class spell list, are really coming into play at lower levels, which I think appropriately balances what people have called an exponentially powerful class. They've continued their pattern that they did with the Evoker in Playtest 5 of essentially having your subclass feature add some spells from that spell school to your spells known list. So Abjuration is going to add an Abjuration spell, Diviner is going to add a Divination spell, etc., etc., instead of that gold and time cost discount for copying spells into the spellbook. They've fixed a loophole with Arcane Ward, which required just an Abjuration spell to be cast, but not a spell slot. enabling this interaction with an Eldritch Invocation that allowed you to cast Mage Armor without a spell slot as many times as you wanted. It created these kind of broken, survivable builds. So now it requires you to spend a spell slot to create it. They have advertised a buff in you not being required to actually cast the spell. You can just expend the spell slot to boost your Abjuration Ward. This is worse in every way than not doing that and just casting the spell, because then you get a spell out of it. But I suppose if there's no valid targets for your abjuration spells or something, it's not great. It's not a great selection. Spellbreaker is a new feature. Spellbreaker allows you to have Dispel Magic always prepared, and you can cast it as a bonus action and add your proficiency bonus to the ability check that it requires. So you are much, much better at dispelling other spells. We have some relatively small changes to subclasses like the Diviner and the Evoker and the Illusionist in this playtest as well. The Diviner is getting one change to their Arcane Eye. It now is going to give you a selection when you invoke it of what sort of extrasensory thing you want to activate. Other than that, it is relatively the same subclass. The big deal with Evoker is that two features have switched where they are in your class progression. You're going to get your Potent Cantrip right at 3rd level, and then you have to wait until 6th level to get Sculpt Spells. Sculpt Spells is that like always on careful casting for your area of effect damage spells. I think to a certain extent, right, Potent Cantrip, no one is a huge fan of Potent Cantrip. It says your damaging cantrips even affect creatures who avoid the brunt of the damage. You get half damage on saves as well. While this does increase your DPR with cantrips, cantrips are like not what you want to be doing most of the time. Cantrips tend to do very little damage, and so the half damage is very small. Although it is true that over time it does add up if you're casting cantrips a lot. But wizards have a tendency to want to be casting leveled spells, and so I don't know that this is particularly potent. The Sculpt Spells, on the other hand, is a very popular feature. It's a always-on careful spell for your AoE damage, and as a result, you know, when you start to get those 2nd and 3rd level damaging spells that hit an area, you're going to be missing that Sculpt Spells ability. I think that from a game design perspective, having the problem of hitting your allies and then having the solution given to you at a later point, and not too much later, but like a level or two later, is kind of good. It's going to feel right that your Evoker is like blasting people, and then they learn how to not do that. I like it a lot. I think, you know, obviously you get cantrips at 1st level, and then your cantrips get better at 3rd level, so there is this feeling of progression I like for this class. Many people have noted, and I think I agree, that the earlier a feature comes online, the better it is for you, especially if it's a good feature, especially if it's an often used feature. And since Potent Cantrip is a weak, not often used feature, having that be earlier is worse than having it be later. And Sculpt Spells being later is worse than having it being earlier. So this is a nerf for the subclass, but it's a popular subclass, and I think it'll still see a ton of play. The Illusionist has a couple of changes. Malleable Illusion is now a bonus action rather than an action, which is really nice. That's the ability, you can change the nature of the illusion after you've cast the spell. So maybe you've cast an illusion of a person standing there and then you want them to move, took an action to kind of do that, or maybe make them into a different person. Now you can do that with a bonus action. I think it's pretty good. Illusory Self is this kind of ability to create an illusory duplicate of yourself when someone attacks you, and then basically you make them automatically miss, right? This was a feature that you could only use once per short rest, but now you can also cast a level 2 spell slot to invoke it again. Illusory Reality is now just kind of the wording has been changed so that now it's clear what it can and can't do, and it cannot impose conditions like the frightened or charmed condition. And that's it for the wizard. Some very minor class and subclass changes, mostly a story of reverting it to the 2014 version. Like I said, the wizard is already an extremely potent class. It's got a ton of options. It's very popular in 2014, so I sort of understand why they have not gone all in and changing it. Now, some important changes that are coming for the wizard are in the spells that have been altered, but you'll have to check out my miscellaneous video on Playtest 7 coming up after this.